Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're on to bag C of the Tamiya flatbed trailer. We're putting together the suspension and the axles. There's lots of nice bits in this one. We've got the leaf springs, the non-damping dampers, lots of fixings, but not quite so nice are the bushings. They'll work, but for ultimate smoothness and long life we're going to swap them for some bearings. Model shops will usually sell you a set, or of course there's rcbearings.co.uk. Right, step 8, the leaf springs. We need 8 M3 flange nuts, 4 M3 nylocks, 4 U-bolts, 2 stays, 4 M3x14 step screws, 2 leaf spring packs, and 2 spring seats. For plastic there's 2 B7s and 2 B10s that sandwich the springs. In the middle of the leaf pack is a rivet that holds the leaves together. On the outside of the curve we need to offer up one of the large plastic parts, and on the inside a small one. They won't stay put unless you hold them, but they should fit the springs very neatly. If there's a massive gap, the small part is probably the wrong way up. Next we need to slide the 2 U-bolts over the plastic parts. Going down from the large side, the U-bolt should slide into the grooves. Over the threads we offer up a spring seat and press it all the way down while still keeping hold of the U-bolts and the plastic parts so the assembly doesn't fall apart. Lastly, for this bit we need to thread on 4 of the M3 flange nuts. Now it's important that they get done up nice and evenly. So while trying to keep the spring seat flat, spin the nuts on by hand so they bottom out. Then use a cross wrench, tightening them up a little bit at a time, gradually drawing the U-bolts in. Arguably, so we can make sure the suspension is nice and straight in a couple of steps, we should leave the nuts a little bit loose so we can adjust how the parts sit before tightening. But access can be a bit tricky once the springs are on the chassis, but not impossible. At the end of the springs we need to fit the stays. These just slot over the loops in the end of the springs and get the step screws and nylock nut. Do the nut up all the way, repeat on the other end, and that's one assembly ready to go. We do of course need 2 of them, and at this stage they're both the same, but one will get flipped around to make a mirror image in the next step. Step 9, fitting the springs to the chassis. We need 8 M3x10s, 10 M3 flange nuts, 2 M3x25s, 2 5x13 round bushings, the chassis, the 2 suspension plates, and right at the end 2 D7s for the wheel chock storage. Using 2 of the 3x10s we can attach one of the plates. It matches up to the chassis where there's 3 holes. Initially we just want to use the outside 2 with the screws and nuts, leaving them just finger tight. We want the plate to still be able to wobble just a little bit for now. Same goes for the other side. Next we need a spring pack, and we slide in one of the top hat bushings into the pivot hole in the middle. And we pop in a 3x25 with its head up against the bushing's flange. Offer it up to the middle hole in the plate, through the chassis, and we add a nut on the back. Now we can do up the 3 screws and nuts, making sure they're all well nipped up. It's all metal and we want the grippy bits on the flange nuts to get a good grip on the chassis. And just as before, the same goes on the other side. You can also see why the 4 nuts on the spring seat can be a bit tricky to get to. You really need a small spanner to tighten them the rest of the way once the axles go on. A bit further towards the front we have the holders for the wheel chocks. They just attach with 2 of the M3x10s and the flange nuts. The only thing to think about is we want them with the narrow end towards the bottom of the chassis. If they're the wrong way up, the chocks are just going to fall out. Fit both, and that's step 9 complete. Step 10, axles. We need 2 M3 flange nuts, 2 M3x20s, 8 1150 bearings, or the bushings, 8 4mm E-clips, 2 B1s and 2 B6s, and 4 axle shafts. First, because we're using bearings, we don't need to use the grease, and bearings should be pre-lubed and ready to go. If you're using bushings, however, you are going to want to use some of the kit grease, or Tamiya ceramic. First then, we're going to prep the shafts. On the spline end, we need to fit an E-clip. There's a slot it's going to fit into, and we should just be able to use some pliers to squeeze it in, which can of course be easier said than done. If you're not quite straight on them, they do have a nasty habit of pinging off, never to be seen again. Be careful, or if you really want to be safe, put the parts and your hands in a clear plastic bag. That way, if the E-clip does ping off, it's not going to go far. After the first E-clip, we slide on 2 bearings or bushings plus some grease. Then at the flat end, we clip in another E-clip. Repeat for the other 3 and they're ready to go. Next we can grab an axle half. It doesn't really matter which, just make sure you end up with a B1, B6 pair per axle. Push the bearings out towards the E-clips and slot them into the bearing slots. Offer up the mating axle half and massage everything so it fits nicely. Pop a screw in through the centre and thread on a nut on the other side. Nip it up, repeat, and that's the 2 axles ready to fit. Step 11, not too surprisingly, is fitting the axles. This step is a bit of a monster. It's really 2 sub-steps though. While there's quite a few bits, it's still quite manageable. We need 4 M3 flange nuts, 4 M3 nylock nuts, 4 suspension stays, 8 M3x20s, 4 3x18 step screws, 4 3x14 step screws, the chassis, and for the plastic we need 2 B13s and 2 B14s, and try and keep them in order so you know which is which, although it's not really too difficult to work out where they go if you do get them mixed up. We start by popping 2 of the M3x20s into the holes in the base of the stay. Then we slide the screws in through the holes towards the edge of the axle. We want the side of the axle with the screw head in the centre on the same side as the stays. And as we go, we want the long side of the stay to be outwards. So on the front axle it wants to stick out forwards, and on the back it wants to stick out rearwards. To fit, we just need to screw the screws into the stays already fitted to the leaf packs. As always, for now we'll just leave them slightly loose until a bit more of the assembly is together. There's 3 more to do, just keep in mind the orientation. Give it all a bit of a workout to settle everything and nip up the screws. Unfortunately, once the arms go on, they do block access. Usually there's enough slop in the system that it's going to work out just fine though. The arms are fitted using the long step screws at the plate end and short step screws at the axle end with the nylock nuts. You want the end of the arm with the built-in spacer at the plate, and we want the bend to be downwards. You'll probably need to give the axles a bit of a wiggle to get everything to slot in, which is why it's nice to have the spring seat nuts a little bit loose. We can square everything up and then go around and tighten them, but access really is a pain. Even with a spanner, it takes ages to tighten them up. The trick is, once all the fixings are tight, the whole assembly should rock back and forth with very little effort. There's going to be a little bit of friction, but it should feel very nice and smooth. If it feels a bit grabby, something is well out of alignment and needs to be looked at. Usually loosening and retightening some of the screws will sort it out. Step 12, the non-damping dampers. We need 4 bodies and 4 caps, which come pre-assembled, so we do need to unscrew them. 4 damper shafts, 4 coil springs, and when I notice them, we also need 4 B11 rod ends. To assemble, we use a screwdriver to help hold the damper shaft. Add some grease to the shaft, slide a damper body over the end, then notice you forgot the rod ends. Thread a rod end onto the end of the shaft, but do be careful not to over tighten them and strip out the plastic, or sometimes I've even seen them crack. Now we just need to pop a spring in from the top, thread on a cap, and that's 1 non-damping damper complete. Repeat 3 more times and that's the full set ready to fit. Step 13, fitting the dampers. We need 4 M3 flange nuts, 4 M3 nylock nuts, 4 M3x20s, 4 3x14 step screws, and 4 damper collars. To fit a damper, we start at the top by popping a damper collar into the top of the damper, insert a screw and offer it up to the hole in the chassis and thread on a flange nut. At the bottom, we slot the rod end into the stay on the axle, pop in a step screw and use a nylock on the back. Nip up the screws and that's 1 damper fitted. Repeat with the other 3 and that's the suspension complete. It's worth doing 1 final check to make sure it all moves nicely. There shouldn't be any snags and they should be nice and smooth. Step 14, wheels. We need 12 M2x6s, 12 M2 nuts, 4 V1s and V2s, and 8 tyres. First step is to pull the tyres over the wheels. They're symmetrical, however there's usually one side where the sidewall looks a bit better than the other, so aim to get the good side so it's going to be the one showing. Next we need a wheel pair, a V1 and a V2. To align them, there's a set of nubs that fit into holes. You can offer them up to each other and press them into place. Just make sure the nubs go into the plain holes and not the holes for the nuts. And now for the tricky bit. We need to drop a nut into one of the hex-shaped holes. Tweezers usually work okay, but the nuts do have a habit of standing on edge rather than sitting flat on the bottom. Hold the nut in place, then from the outside we thread in a screw, just taking up the slack for now. Repeat with the other two, again just taking up the slack. Now, because these screws are going to see a lot of pushing and pulling as the wheel rolls, we really do need to use some thread lock. But we need to be extremely careful where it goes. The thread lock will attack the plastic and make it brittle if we get it in the wrong place. The trick is to use a liquid thread lock and a cocktail stick. There's a little bit of the screw threads that's exposed beyond the nut, so we just need to get a tiny amount on the threads of all three. Then we loosen the screws, being careful not to drop the nut off the end, and retighten. This is going to get just enough of the thread lock in the threads to do its job without spilling it all over the plastic. There will still be a little bit of excess though, so we just need to mop it up with a paper towel. Rinse and repeat, and we've got the 4 wheels ready to go. Although Tamiya do want us to glue the tyres to the wheels. On Tamiya lorries I've never really found this to be necessary. Especially if running indoors with a sensible motor, they stay put just fine as they are. Gluing just makes them difficult to take apart later, and of course you risk getting a drip of glue down the sidewall, making them look a bit untidy. Okay, step 15, fitting the wheels. We need 4 M4 flange nylock nuts, 4 spline to hex wheel hexes, the wheels, and of course the chassis. A nice simple one. We just pop a hex on the end of an axle, it'll only fit one way, offer up the wheel and get it to sit over the hex, might need a bit of a wiggle. Then while holding the tyre we can thread on a nut and do it up. Repeat with the other 3 and that's bag C complete. Well, there is step 16, but that just involves putting the legs down, so it's not exactly complicated. Right, the trailer can now be trailered. There's still bag D to go though, with the deck, the bumper and lots of other little bits, but as far as the major function goes, it's a working trailer. Right, as always then, thanks for watching, like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!